There was a time when Rolls-Royce wasn't a company at all. It was a word. The word you reached for when you wanted to say something was the best that could possibly be made, the best car in the world, the engine that won the Battle of Britain. At its peak, it employed around 80,000 people, and it was one of only 3 companies on the whole of the Earth that could build the great engines of modern flight. It had survived 2 world wars. It had survived the Depression. It had buried its founders, outlived its rivals, and never once in 60 years set itself a goal it could not reach. It was, quite simply, the safest name in Britain. The one thing everyone believed could never fall. And then, on a winter morning in 1971, it called in the receiver. It didn't fall slowly, the way great companies usually do. It fell all at once, and what brought it down wasn't a war, or a rival, or the loss of its founders. It was an engine, a single engine built inside those walls that should have been the finest thing the company ever made. How does an engine destroy the company that builds the best engines on Earth? Chapter 1. The Boy Who Sold Newspapers. The story of the most trusted name in British engineering begins not in a boardroom or a laboratory, but with a hungry 9-year-old selling newspapers on the streets of London. His name was Frederick Henry Royce, and he was born on the 27th of March, 1863, in the Cambridgeshire village of Alwalton, where his father ran a flour mill on land leased from the Crown. It should have been a steady start. It wasn't. The mill failed. James Royce was not a careful businessman, and when the business went under, the family came apart with it, scattered to London, to cheaper rooms and harder work. When Royce's father died in 1872, the boy was left with almost nothing at all. 1 year of formal schooling, a mother taking in lodgers, and the streets. So he worked them. He sold newspapers for W.H. Smith. He carried telegrams for the post office, learning the city street by street, door by door, in all weathers, for a few coins a week. It was the kind of childhood that broke children, or hardened them into something narrow and frightened. It did neither to Royce. What it gave him, strangely, was patience. The patience of a boy who had learned very young that nothing arrived unless you went and got it yourself. His way out came from an aunt, who found the money for an apprenticeship with the Great Northern Railway at Peterborough. And there, in the roar and steam and oil smell of the locomotive sheds, the boy who had nothing found the one thing that would order the rest of his life. Royce learned machines the way other men learned languages, fluently, instinctively, by taking them to pieces and refusing to put them back, until he understood exactly why each part was the shape it was. He didn't just want to know that a thing worked. He needed to know why and whether it could be made to work better. The money ran out before the apprenticeship was finished, so Royce did what desperate skilled men did in the 1880s. He walked. He tramped the country looking for work, took a job with a tool-making firm in Leeds, working long hours for little pay, and finally landed with an electric lighting company in Liverpool. Electricity was the new frontier then, barely understood, and Royce taught himself the whole of it largely from books, read late at night when other men were asleep. By 1882, he knew more about electric lighting than most men twice his age. In 1884, with a friend named Ernest Claremont and the grand combined sum of around £20, Royce set up his own firm in a small workshop in Cook Street, Manchester. Claremont had the steadier business head. Royce had the hands and the obsession. They started with electric doorbells, modest, reliable little things. Then dynamos. Then electric cranes, heavy and beautifully made, the sort that would still be lifting loads in a Manchester yard half a century later. The firm prospered, quietly, on a single principle that Royce stated in a sentence the company would carry like scripture for the next 100 years. Take the best that exists, he said, and make it better. He worked himself half to death, proving it. Men who knew him told the same stories over and over. Royce skipping meals, sleeping at his bench, tearing apart a component that already worked perfectly, because perfectly was not the same as perfectly right. He once kept a whole workshop standing idle while he reground a casting by hand because the finish the machine had left on it offended him. He drove himself the way he drove his metal past the point of sense towards a standard that existed only in his own head. And then, in 1903, the obsession found a new and far larger target. Royce bought himself a motor car, a second-hand French Decauville, one of the better machines money could buy. And it appalled him. It was noisy. It stalled. It vibrated and leaked and shook, and it behaved, in Royce's judgment, like a machine built by people who simply didn't care whether it ran well or not. A lesser man would have complained and lived with it. Royce took it apart. He spread the French car across his workshop floor, studied every casting and every bearing, and concluded that nearly all of it had been done carelessly, and that he, with no experience of motor cars whatsoever, could do every piece of it better. He was 40 years old, and in April 1904, he drove his Answer out of the Cook Street Works under its own power. 2 cylinders, 10 horsepower. And so smooth, so quiet, that the men who rode in it swore you could hear the dashboard clock ticking over the sound of the running engine. In an age of motoring that meant noise and breakdowns and grease to the elbow, Royce had built something that felt almost uncanny in its refinement. He had built a small masterpiece. The trouble was that Henry Royce, the supreme engineer, had no earthly idea how to sell it. Chapter 2. The Hyfil, the answer to that problem, was already alive and restless, 300 miles to the south, and it could hardly have been more different from Royce. The Honourable Charles Stuart Rolls was born on the 27th of August, 1877, in Berkeley Square, London, the third son of the first Baron Langattock, into money, land, and a name that opened every door he approached. He went to Eton, where his fascination with engines and machine oil earned him an affectionate nickname that said everything about him, Dirty Rolls. Then to Trinity College, Cambridge. He was tall and charming and entirely fearless, and the new century had handed him the perfect outlet for all three. Speed. Rolls raced motor cars when racing motor cars was still half sport and half attempted suicide. He set records. He won trials. He was one of the first Englishmen to qualify as a balloonist, and later as an aeroplane pilot, throwing himself at every new and dangerous machine the age produced. To fund all this, and because he genuinely loved the things, he opened a motor dealership in London, C.S. Rolls and Company, importing the best Continental cars and selling them to the wealthy, and he was quietly miserable about it, because the cars he sold were French and Belgian, and Rolls, a patriot and a snob in roughly equal measure, wanted to sell a British car, a great one worthy of his name and reputation, one he could put before his wealthy friends without apology. He had searched for it for years. The Continental makers were simply ahead. The British efforts were, with very few exceptions, an embarrassment. By 1904, Rolls had nearly given up believing a great British motor car existed at all. It took a third man to change that, and his name deserves to be remembered as much as the 2 on the badge. Henry Edmonds was an engineer and company director who happened to know both men, and who possessed the instinct of a natural matchmaker. He could see that Royce had exactly what Rolls lacked, and Rolls had exactly what Royce lacked. Edmonds had seen Royce's little car, and he was certain. The difficulty was getting Rolls to come and look. Rolls had a fixed suspicion that nothing worth selling could possibly come out of a backstreet Manchester workshop, and he resisted the trip for weeks. Edmonds, in the end, all but dragged him north. On the 4th of May, 1904, the 2 men met for lunch at the Midland Hotel in Manchester. Within minutes, Rolls's snobbery had collapsed entirely. Here was an engineer who spoke about motor cars the way Rolls felt about them, as things that should be perfect and could be. Rolls went home and told his business partner, with the certainty of a man who had found what he'd searched years for, that he had met the greatest motor engineer in the world. The bargain they made was beautifully simple. Royce would build the cars. Rolls would sell them exclusively through his dealership, and the cars would carry both names. Rolls first, because his name sold better in the drawing rooms of England, and Royce second, because his hands had made them. Rolls-Royce Limited was registered on the 15th of March, 1906, with a capital of £60,000. In time, the small hyphen joining the 2 names would come to mean more than the names themselves. But the man who truly turned the partnership into a company was neither Rolls nor Royce. He was Claude Johnson, the commercial managing director, the organizer, the salesman of pure genius, the one steady hand that held the obsessive engineer and the restless aristocrat together long enough for greatness to take root. They called him the hyphen in Rolls-Royce, and the joke held a deep truth. Royce built, Rolls charmed. Johnson made it a business that could last, and it was Johnson who, in 1907, carried out the single greatest piece of salesmanship in the company's history. He took the 12th example of the firm's new 40-50 horsepower model, had it finished in silver paint with silver-plated fittings, named it the Silver Ghost for the spectral quiet of its running, and set out to prove to the world that it could not be broken. He entered it in a reliability trial of 15,000 miles, driven almost continuously, day after day, under the strict observation of the Royal Automobile Club. Other cars of the day rattled themselves to pieces over a few hundred. The Silver Ghost simply would not fail. When the engineers finally stripped it down at the end, the wear they found was so slight it was almost not worth recording. The motoring press reached for the only words that fit: the best car in the world. The phrase stuck, and it stuck because no one could honestly argue with it. There should have been long decades of triumph ahead for the three men who built this. Instead, tragedy came fast, and it came first for the youngest and most fearless of them. Charles Rolls had been drifting away from motorcars and towards the air. On the 2nd of June, 1910, he became the first man to fly an aeroplane across the English Channel and back without landing, a feat that made him a national hero. He was 32 and at the very height of his fame. Just over a month later, on the 12th of July 1910, at a flying display at Bournemouth, the tail of his Wright Flyer broke away in mid-air. The machine dropped from the sky. Rolls was killed at once, the first Briton to die in a powered aeroplane, and the first of the company's many losses to the element it would one day rule. Royce, they said, wept when the news reached him, and within 2 years his own body began to fail under the weight of the life he had driven it through. By 1911, he was so gravely ill that doctors gave him only months to live. He survived, but he would never again work regularly at the factory. He was moved to the gentler air of the south coast, to a house at West Wittering in Sussex, and there he worked for the remaining 20-odd years of his life, drawing, refining, demanding, his designs carried back and forth to the works by a relay of devoted engineers who treated his penciled corrections as law. He died in 1933, still correcting other men's drawings from his bed. He had built a name that meant perfection. What he could never have imagined was that the name would one day be carried not by motor cars at all, but by something vastly larger, vastly more powerful, and vastly more dangerous to the company that built it. Chapter 3. When the cars had to become engines. The thing that saved Rolls-Royce and the thing that would eventually destroy it were, in the end, the same thing: aero engines. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, a firm that built superb luxury motor cars suddenly looked like a firm that built expensive luxuries the nation could no longer justify. The War Office wanted lorries and armoured cars and ambulances, and, with growing urgency, it wanted engines for the flimsy aeroplanes that the war was transforming, almost month by month, from a curiosity into a weapon. The government turned to Royce, ill and exiled on the coast, and asked him to design an aero engine. He had never built one in his life, so he did what he had always done. He had the available French and German aero engines brought to him, took them apart, decided their makers had been careless, and set out to better them. The result, first run in 1915, was the Eagle, a V12 of around 225 horsepower, and at a single stroke, one of the finest aero engines anywhere in the world. The temperamental rivals of the day failed and overheated and threw their parts across the sky. The Eagle, built to Royce's standard, simply kept running. By the war's end, Rolls-Royce engines powered a large share of British military aviation, and the Derby Works had transformed itself, almost without anyone deciding it should, from a maker of fine cars into one of the most important engine builders in the country. And then came the moment that told the world exactly what those engines could do. In June 1919, two airmen, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown, climbed into a converted Vickers-Vimy bomber on a rough field at St. John's in Newfoundland and turned its nose east, out over the open Atlantic. No one had ever flown the ocean non-stop. The weather very nearly killed them. They flew blind through fog so dense they lost all sense of which way was up, and ice built on the engines until Brown, by the legend that grew up around the flight, climbed out into the slipstream again and again to clear the intakes by hand. 16 hours later, they came down nose first into an Irish bog, filthy and frozen and alive, having done the thing every expert had called impossible. Two Rolls-Royce Eagle engines had carried them every single mile, without once missing a beat. That was the lesson the company carved into itself and never forgot. In the air, reliability was not a luxury or a selling point. It was the line between coming home and not. And reliability was the one thing Rolls-Royce understood more deeply than any company on Earth. Through the 1920s, the aero engines quietly grew into the heart of the business, while the cars stayed its glittering public face. Then, in the early 1930s, came the contest that would shape everything that followed. The Schneider Trophy was an international race for seaplanes. Fast, glamorous, and, beneath the glamour, deadly serious, because it drove engine design forward faster than any peacetime program ever could. Britain meant to win it for good, and to win it, Rolls-Royce built an engine known simply as the R. It was, by the standards of its day, almost insane. Supercharged, screaming, fed on a vicious brew of fuels that would have wrecked an ordinary engine in minutes, the R was pushed to power outputs that engineers a few years earlier would have called fantasy. In 1931, it carried the Supermarine S-96B to victory in the race, and then, days later, to the first flight in human history, above 400 miles an hour. But the prize that mattered wasn't the trophy, it was the knowledge. The men who built the R had learned, right at the trembling edge of what metal could endure, how to drag enormous power out of an engine without the engine tearing itself apart. Every lesson poured straight into the engine that came next. Royce had begun sketching it before his death. A 27-litre, liquid-cooled V12, developed from a private venture the company labelled the PV12. It first ran in 1933, the year Royce died. They gave it a name borrowed, like all their piston aero engines, from a bird of prey. They called it the Merlin, and the Merlin would change the course of history. But before it could, the company had to survive a second great threat, and this one came not from a rival, but from inside the engine itself. The early Merlins were difficult, dangerous things, prone to failures that killed test pilots. Cylinder heads cracked. The cooling system fought the engineers at every turn. There were stretches in the mid-1930s when the whole program looked like more trouble than it could possibly be worth, and a more timid company might have quietly abandoned it. What saved it was the culture Royce had built, and one particular man. Ernest Hyfil ran the experimental department and would in time run the entire works and sit in the House of Lords. He was hard, blunt, and utterly relentless, and he simply refused to let the Merlin fail. Hyfil drove it through every one of its troubles by sheer organisation and force of will, and in doing so he hardened into Rolls-Royce a habit of mind that would serve it magnificently for 30 years, and then, one day, very nearly kill it. The habit was this: whatever the engineering problem is, we will solve it. We always have. Chapter 4. The Engine That Won the War. By the time the Second War came, the Merlin was ready, and what it did in those years passed out of engineering altogether and into legend. It powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane through the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the engine behind the fighters that held the line when there was nothing else left to hold it. It powered the Lancaster bombers that flew into the dark over Germany night after night, year after year. It powered the wooden Mosquito, the fastest thing in the sky. And in one of the war's great quiet miracles, when the North American P-51 Mustang turned out to be a lovely airframe, shackled to a disappointing engine, someone had the wit to fit a Merlin in its place and turned it into the finest long-range escort fighter of the entire war, the aircraft that finally let Allied bombers reach Berlin and come home again. The scale of it needs saying just once. Across every factory and every nation that built it, 176 Merlins were made. Rolls-Royce built around 82,000 of them in Derby and in the great New Shadow factories thrown up at Crewe and at Hillington in Glasgow. The Packard Company built more than 55,000 under license in the United States. Ford in Manchester built another 30,000. It stands among the most produced and most decisive pieces of machinery in the whole of the war, and it was kept flying by people whose names deserved to stand beside the generals. There was Stanley Hooker, a mathematician who joined Rolls-Royce knowing almost nothing about engines, and who then redesigned the Merlin supercharger so thoroughly that he wrung hundreds of extra horsepower out of it, which at altitude was the difference between the hunter and the hunted. There was Hyves running the vast enterprise with a hardness that concealed real care for the men on his floor. And there was Beatrice Schilling. Schilling was an engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, a competition motorcyclist in her own time, and the woman who cured one of the deadliest flaws in the early Merlin. In a steep dive, the engine's carburetor would flood and the engine would cut out. At the precise instant, a pilot twisting through a dogfight could least afford to lose it. Schilling designed a simple brass restrictor, a small disc with a precisely sized hole that solved the problem almost overnight. The RAF's fighter pilots, with the rough affection of men whose lives she had saved, named it after her. They called it Miss Schilling's Orifice. It is hard to imagine a more honest tribute. When the war ended, Rolls-Royce stood as something close to a national treasure. The name on the cars had always meant luxury and perfection. Now the name on the engines meant something deeper still. It meant the thing that had helped win the war, the thing that, when everything depended on it, had never once let the country down. There was no higher reputation in all of British industry. To call any object the Rolls-Royce of its kind was to say it could not be bettered, and everyone everywhere understood precisely what was meant. The company did not sit back on it. While the cars moved into their elegant post-war prime, the stately Silver Cloud, and from 1965 the sleek, modern Silver Shadow, still hand-finished, still wearing the spirit of ecstasy and the royal warrants. The engine men threw themselves into the jet age that the war had blasted open. They built on the pioneering work of Frank Whittle, the RAF officer who had invented the British jet engine in the teeth of official indifference. Rolls-Royce produced the Welland, which powered the Gloucester Meteor into service in 1944, the only Allied jet fighter to fly operationally during the war. Then came engine after engine, each extending the lead. The Derwent, the Nene, the Avon. The Dart, which in 1953 became the first turboprop in regular airline service anywhere on Earth. And the Conway, the first bypass turbofan ever to enter service. The direct ancestor of every big modern airliner engine, including the very one this story is truly about. Engine by engine, contract by contract, the aero division swelled until it dwarfed the cars that had given the company its name. By the early 1960s, Rolls-Royce was no longer a car maker that also built engines. It was one of the three great aero engine companies on the planet, standing level with the American giants Pratt and Whitney and General Electric. And it was the only one of the three that was not American. It had survived 2 world wars and the Depression. It had buried its founders and outlived its rivals. It carried a name that meant, quite simply, the best that could be made, and it was about to place a bet so enormous that even Rolls-Royce could not afford to lose it. Chapter 5. The Cathedral of Sound. To understand what was lost, you have to first stand inside it, and the place to stand is Derby, on a weekday morning in the middle 1960s, at the gates of the works on Nightingale Road. Imagine arriving for the morning shift. The buses come in from Allenton and Alveston and Chaddesden, emptying men out into the grey light, thousands of them, in a steady current that has flowed along these same pavements every working morning for 50 years. They clock in, the cards stamped, the time recorded, and they pass through the gates into a place that is less a factory than a small self-contained world, with its own roads and its own rhythms and its own particular smell, the one a Derby man could recognise blindfold for the rest of his life. Hot metal and cutting oil, and threaded through all of it, the faint, sweet reek of kerosene. This was the heart of the most respected engine company on Earth, and it ran on craft. Not the brute mass production of the American giants, churning out parts by the million, but something older and prouder, the conviction, inherited directly from Royce himself, that an engine was a thing to be built by men who understood every component in their hands. The fitters at Derby were the aristocracy of the British shop floor. A skilled engine fitter could feel a clearance of a few thousandths of an inch with his fingertips. He could hear in the run-up of an engine the half-second of hesitation that meant something deep inside was not quite right, and he could very often tell you which bearing it was before any instrument confirmed it. And these men were not born. They were made by an apprenticeship system that was, in its day, one of the wonders of British industry. To be taken on as a Rolls-Royce apprentice at Derby was to be set apart. The competition for places was fierce, the training was years-long and merciless in its standards, and a boy spent those years rotated through shop after shop, the foundry, the machine shops, the fitting bays, the test beds, until he had felt the whole of engine-making pass through his own hands. The company ran its own technical college to produce not just fitters and turners, but the engineers who would one day design the engines themselves. The discipline was old-fashioned and unbending. A component machined a fraction outside tolerance was not quietly passed. It was rejected, and the apprentice was made to understand precisely why, because at Rolls-Royce the difference between good and good enough was the whole of the company's reputation, and every boy who came through those gates was taught to carry it. Decades afterwards, retired men still introduced themselves, with quiet pride, as Rolls-Royce apprentices, as though it were a regiment they had served in. In a sense, it was. Move deeper into the works and the sound builds, the machine shops where the great forgings were turned and milled and ground to tolerances that would have been thought impossible a generation before. The fitting shops where the engines came together, piece by patient piece, each one assembled, inspected, signed for, and inspected again. And then, out at the edges of the site, the test beds, the cathedrals of sound. Here a finished engine was bolted into a cradle, fuel and instruments connected, and run. When a jet engine is opened up to full power in an enclosed cell, the noise is not a sound you hear so much as a pressure you feel. A physical wall of it that comes up through the concrete floor and into your chest and your teeth. The men who worked the test beds lived inside that noise for 30 years. Some of them went a little deaf for it. None of them, in the remembering, ever seemed to mind, because what they were listening to was the proof. The moment an engine they had built came alive and ran true. Over all of it, in those years, presided men whose names are part of the legend. Stanley Hooker, the supercharger genius of the Merlin, now a grand old figure of the gas turbine world. Cyril Lovesey and Arthur Rubbra, veterans of the piston engine triumphs, carrying the old standards into the jet age. And, sharpest of them all, a brilliant, difficult, indispensable engineer named Adrian Lombard, known to everyone as Lom, the chief engineer, the man who could walk onto a test bed where an engine was misbehaving in a way that had defeated everyone else, listen to it, look at it, and tell you what was wrong. Hold on to that name. Lombard. The story turns on him later, in a way nobody at Derby in 1965 could possibly have foreseen. Chapter 6. A company town the size of a city. The works made the engines, but the works also made Derby, and that is the thing the ledgers never quite capture. For tens of thousands of families across the city, Rolls-Royce was not simply where the money came from. It was the structure the whole of life was built around. A boy left school at 15 and went up to the works because his father was there, and very often because his grandfather had been there before that. 3 generations of the same family could be on the site at once, in different shops, nodding to each other across the canteen. When the company prospered, Derby prospered. When the works took on apprentices, Derby's young men had a future. The wage packet that came home on a Friday paid the rent in the terraced streets, kept the corner shops alive, filled the working men's clubs of an evening, and the chapels and churches on a Sunday. It paid, too, for the things that made a hard working life bearable. The company sports grounds, where the cricket and football teams of the different departments played each other in leagues that men took every bit as seriously as the work itself. The brass and silver bands, the social clubs, the annual outings to the seaside packed onto chartered trains. There was an entire ecosystem of belonging that grew up in the shadow of the chimneys, the pubs where the same men drank in the same corners after the same shifts for 40 years, the streets where everyone's husband or father or brother worked up rolls. A Derby family measured its own security by the health of the company. As long as Rolls-Royce was strong, the future was settled. It was the bedrock under everything, so solid that nobody thought to question whether it could ever move, and the pride in it ran deep, because the men knew exactly what they were making and exactly how good it was. This was not anonymous work. A fitter at Derby could open his newspaper, read about a record-breaking flight, or a great airliner entering service and know, with complete and justified certainty, that the engine carrying it had passed through hands like his, on a bench like his, a few miles up the road. When the Vulcan bombers thundered overhead, when the new jets climbed out of London Airport bound for New York, Derby had built the things that pushed them through the sky. There is a particular dignity in that kind of work, the dignity of the maker, and the men of Derby had it in full measure. A man could spend 40 years on the same bench and never once doubt that what he did with his hands mattered, because the evidence flew over his own rooftop. The trade unions were woven through all of it, strong, organized, and, on the whole, proud of the company they bargained with. The relationship was not always smooth. This was British industry, and there were disputes and demarcations and the ordinary frictions of the shop floor. But underneath ran a shared understanding that this was a place worth working, building things worth building, and that the name over the gate stood for something neither side wished to see cheapened. When the bad years finally came, that loyalty would be tested in ways no one could have imagined, and it would hold, which somehow made it sadder still. Women had threaded through this world too, never more so than in the war years, when they had poured into the shadow factories to build the Merlins that won the Battle of Britain, and many had stayed afterwards, in the wiring shops and the inspection departments and the offices, part of the fabric of the place. The Rolls-Royce of the Golden Age was not a single building or a single trade. It was a whole way of life, holding tens of thousands of people inside it, organized around the simple, steady certainty that there would be engines to build tomorrow and the year after, and for as long as anyone could sensibly imagine. That certainty was the most valuable thing the company owned, and it was the one thing that could not be remade once it was gone. Chapter 7. The two words that meant perfection. Step back from Derby now and look at what the name meant to the world outside, because by the middle 1960s, Rolls-Royce had become something almost no company in history has ever achieved. It had become a unit of measurement. To call something the Rolls-Royce of its kind was to make the highest claim the English language allowed. The Rolls-Royce of typewriters, the Rolls-Royce of fountain pens, the Rolls-Royce of anything at all. The phrase had detached itself from the company entirely and floated free into the language, a synonym for the best that could be made, instantly understood in every corner of the English-speaking world. No advertising budget on earth can buy that. It is earned over decades, one flawless product at a time, and Rolls-Royce had earned it twice over, once with the cars and once, more importantly, with the engines. The cars remained the public face, and what a face it was. At Crewe, the Silver Shadow and the Phantom were built and finished by hand, the coachwork by Mulliner Park Ward, the timber and leather worked to a standard the rest of the motor industry could only envy. These were the cars of royalty and heads of state, of film stars and oil sheiks, each one crowned with the spirit of ecstasy, leaning into the wind, each one carrying the royal warrants that said the crown itself chose no lesser machine. The cars sold the legend. But the cars, by the 1960s, were the smaller part of the business, beautiful, profitable in their way, and almost beside the point. Remember that, because it matters enormously later. The cars and the engines were two very different enterprises wearing the same proud name, and their fates would turn out to be very different too, because the real empire was in the air, and the engine that built that empire was the Conway. It was the world's first bypass turbofan to enter airline service, and it did something that, looking back, changed the shape of ordinary life. Picture what crossing the Atlantic had meant only a few years before, a long, droning, multi-stop ordeal in a propeller aircraft, or days at sea in an ocean liner. Then came the big jets, and the Conway was among the engines under their wings. It powered versions of the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8, the aircraft that turned the ocean crossing into an afternoon's flight. A businessman could breakfast in London and dine in New York the same day. Families separated by an ocean could be reunited in hours rather than weeks. The world did not shrink gradually. It shrank suddenly in the space of a few years around 1960, and Rolls-Royce engines were among the things that shrank it. The Spey powered a whole generation of airliners and military aircraft after that. The Dart turboprop went on and on, in service for decades, one of the most successful engines of its type ever built. In military aviation, Rolls-Royce power flew in the frontline aircraft of the Royal Air Force and a dozen other nations besides. This was the achievement that mattered. Of the entire world, only 3 companies could design and build the great gas turbine engines that powered modern aviation: Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and Rolls-Royce. The first 2 were American, backed by the bottomless industrial might of the United States. The third was British, run out of Derby, the inheritor of Henry Royce's workshop creed. That a single British company could stand level with the Americans in the most demanding high technology of the age was a source of genuine national pride, and rightly so. It was the jewel in the crown of British engineering, and the country knew it, and there is a particular ache in writing that down, knowing what came next, because everything that made the company great, the refusal to accept second best, the absolute confidence that any problem could be solved, the willingness to attempt what others called impossible, every one of those magnificent qualities was about to be turned, by circumstances no one fully saw coming, into the instrument of its undoing. Chapter 8. The Summit. The highest point came in 1966, and like most summits, no one standing on it understood it was the top. That year, Rolls-Royce moved to make itself unassailable. It bought its last great domestic rival, Bristol Siddeley Engines, for £63.6 million, a vast sum and a deliberate one. There was a fear in Derby that Bristol Siddeley might form an alliance with the American firm Pratt and Whitney and the French engine maker, and so let a foreign rival in through the back door of British aviation. Rolls-Royce moved to prevent it the simplest way it knew, by swallowing the competitor whole. At a stroke, there was no serious home rival left standing. One British company now held very nearly the whole of British aero engine design in its hands, and what it gained in the deal was extraordinary. Into Rolls-Royce came the great works at Filton, near Bristol, and with it, some of the most advanced engines in the world. The Pegasus, the remarkable engine that swiveled its own exhaust to point downwards, and so gave the Harrier jump jet its almost magical ability to rise straight up off the ground and hang in the air like a kestrel, and the Olympus, the engine that powered the mighty Vulcan bomber, and that was now being developed, in partnership with the French, for a slender white needle of an aircraft that was going to fly faster than sound and carry passengers while it did it. They were going to call it Concorde. The Filton men brought all of this with them, and Rolls-Royce was now not merely the dominant British engine company. It was very nearly the only one. The numbers, by this point, were the numbers of a giant. Rolls-Royce employed around 80,000 people, the population of a sizable town, on the company's books, every one of them depending on it. It was among the largest employers in the entire country. It was no longer a company so much as a national institution, rendered in steel and aluminium, carrying on its shoulders a good part of the prestige of British industry itself, and the confidence at the top matched the scale. This was, after all, a company that had been right about everything that mattered for 60 years. It had been right about the Silver Ghost, right about the Eagle, right about the Merlin, right about the jet engines that now powered the world. Its leaders had inherited a culture that had never, in its whole history, set itself a serious engineering goal and failed to reach it. When the senior men at Derby looked at the future, they did not see risk. They saw the next thing to be conquered, and they had always conquered the next thing. The chief executive, Sir Denning Pearson, had become convinced of where that next thing lay. Not in Britain, not even in Europe, for Rolls-Royce had stepped back from the engine work on the new European Airbus, judging the real prize to be elsewhere. The real prize was America. The enormous American market for civil airliner engines was the biggest in all of aviation, and it was the home turf of the two American giants. To break into it would mean winning a contract larger than anything Rolls-Royce had ever attempted in its life. It would mean designing an engine more ambitious than anything the company had ever built. It would mean, in plain terms, betting the company on America. To men of lesser confidence, that thought might have brought a long pause. To the leaders of Rolls-Royce in 1966, fresh from swallowing their largest rival, masters of the most respected engineering name on earth, sitting at the head of 80,000 of the most skilled workers in the country, it did not look like a reckless gamble at all. It looked like the natural next step for a company that conquered things. It looked like destiny. The wide-body age was coming. The Americans were designing a new generation of vast airliners that would carry hundreds of passengers at a time, and every one of those aircraft would need engines of a power and size never built before. Rolls-Royce meant to power them. It had the skill. It had the name. It had 60 years of being right. But 1966 would be the summit, the highest point before the fall. And standing up there, with the rival absorbed and the workforce at its peak, and the name meaning perfection in every language that used it, not one person inside those walls could see the cliff that lay a single step ahead. Chapter 9. The Contract Signed in the Dark. The The cliff had a name, and the name was the L-1011 TriStar. In the late 1960s, three great American wide-body airliners were taking shape on the drawing boards at once. Boeing was building the giant 747, McDonnell Douglas was building the DC-10, and Lockheed, a company famous for its military and spy aircraft, returning to the civil market it had left years before, was building the TriStar. Each of these aircraft needed engines, and the contest to power them was the richest prize in aviation. Whoever won would have decades of work. Whoever lost might never get another chance at the American market at all. Rolls-Royce had been building towards this for years, and the engine it offered was the most ambitious thing the company had ever conceived. They called it the RB211, and on paper, it was a marvel. A great turbofan, more powerful and more efficient than anything the company had built, designed to carry the TriStar across the world. To win the contract, Sir David Huddy, the managing director of the Aero Engine division, had moved to the United States and run a relentless sales campaign, living out of American hotels, courting Lockheed, fighting the two American giants on their own ground for the right to power an American aeroplane. And on the 29th of March, 1968, he won. Lockheed chose the RB211 for the TriStar and placed an order for 150 sets of engines. It was a triumph, the British company breaking into America, beating Pratt & Whitney and General Electric for one of the great contracts of the age. In Derby, it felt like vindication of everything the company believed about itself. But look closely at how the deal was done, because the manner of it contained the seeds of everything that followed. It was struck under brutal time pressure. On the evening of the 27th of March, with the Lockheed board meeting in New York and a decision hours away, Rolls-Royce needed the British government to guarantee the deal, and needed it that night. The minister responsible, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, authorised the government's backing late that evening, against the clock, with the Atlantic deadline bearing down. A commitment that would decide the fate of an 80,000-person company was being nailed down in a single frantic night, and the terms of it were the trap. Rolls-Royce did not simply agree to build the engines. It agreed to build them at a fixed price, $840,000 each, with penalty clauses if the engines were delivered late. A fixed price means a simple, ruthless thing. The company carries all the risk. If the engine cost more to develop than expected, Rolls-Royce paid the difference. If it cost more to build than the agreed price, Rolls-Royce swallowed the loss on every single unit. The contract handed all the danger to Derby and kept none of it back. Why would a company famous for its caution accept such terms? Because it had to, or believed it had to. To break into America, you took the deal America offered, or you watched the contract go to a rival and lost the market for a generation. And because Rolls-Royce had been guided by its own past success, it had estimated the costs of earlier engines like the Spey accurately enough, and it trusted that it could do the same again. The men who signed believed, with the deep confidence of 60 years of being right, that they could build this engine within the price. They were about to discover that the RB211 was not like any engine they had ever built before. Chapter 10. The Wonder Material. The trouble lived at the very front of the engine, in the part the company had been proudest of. To understand it, you have to understand what made the RB211 so daring. It was the world's first production engine of its kind to use 3 shafts, 3 separate spinning cores, nested one inside another, each turning at its own best speed. In theory, it was brilliant. More efficient, more compact, more powerful than the simpler engines the Americans built. In practice, it meant that Rolls-Royce was attempting, all at once, on a fixed-price contract against a hard deadline, the most complex aero engine ever designed. Every part of it was being pushed to a new edge at the same time. There was no margin anywhere, and no precedent to fall back on. But the boldest stroke of all was the fan, the great spinning disc of blades at the front of the engine, the part that does most of the work of pushing a modern airliner through the sky. Conventional fan blades were made of titanium, strong, proven, and heavy. Rolls-Royce decided it would not use titanium. It would use something new, something lighter, something that promised to give the RB211 a decisive advantage over every American rival. They called it Hyfil. It was a carbon fibre composite developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, a material that wove threads of carbon into a substance lighter than metal, but in theory, just as strong. To the engineers of the late 1960s, carbon fiber was the wonder material of the future, and Rolls-Royce was going to be the first company in the world to build a great airliner's fan out of it. A Hyfil fan would weigh far less than a titanium one. Less weight at the front meant less weight everywhere, better fuel economy, more power for the same size. It was exactly the kind of leap the company had built its whole reputation on. Take the best that exists and make it better. Henry Royce would have understood the ambition completely. There was just one test the new blades had to pass, and it was a test that has nothing to do with the elegant physics of flight, and everything to do with the brutal reality of the sky. Birds, an aircraft engine, sucking in enormous quantities of air, will sooner or later suck in a bird. It happens on takeoff, on landing, in the crowded air near every airport in the world. And the law is absolute about it. An engine must be able to swallow a bird without flying to pieces. A blade that shatters when it hits a bird does not simply stop the engine. It can send shrapnel tearing through the wing, the fuel tanks, the fuselage. So the certification authorities demand proof, and the proof is as crude as it is unforgiving. They fire bird carcasses into a running engine at full power and watch what happens. In May 1970, on a test bed, Rolls-Royce fired a chicken into a running RB211 fan, turning at full speed, and the wonder material shattered. The Hyfil blades, which had passed so many other tests, could not survive the impact. The carbon fiber layers came apart, delaminated, split, disintegrated, under the violence of the strike. The thing the company had bet so much on, the lightweight leap into the future, failed at the one test it could not be allowed to fail. Birds would always come. The blades had to survive them. And they didn't. It is the single most cinematic moment in the whole long fall of Rolls-Royce, a dead chicken, fired into a spinning engine, and the future of the most respected name in British engineering coming apart in a spray of shattered carbon fibre. It deserves its place as the emblem of the crisis. But it would be wrong, and the company's own engineers knew it was wrong, to call it the cause of what followed. It was one blow among many. The truth is both less dramatic and somehow heavier. The whole engine was in trouble. Chapter 11. The whole engine in trouble. Because here is the thing the simple story leaves out. By the time the chicken shattered the fan, the RB211 was already overweight, already down on power, already behind. Rolls-Royce had, with real prudence, developed a titanium fan blade in parallel, insurance in case Hyfil failed. So when it did fail, the company could fall back on titanium, and it did. But the fallback was not free. Titanium was heavier, which meant the engine grew heavier, which meant it gave less power and burned more fuel than promised. And the titanium itself brought new problems. The engineers found that only one face of the titanium billet was metallurgically fit to make a blade from, which complicated everything. The Hyfil failure had not simply cost a fan. It had cost time, money, weight, and performance, all at the worst possible moment, on an engine that had no margin to spare. And there was a deeper wound, one that had been dealt 3 years earlier, and that almost no one outside Derby understood the importance of. In 1967, Adrian Lombard had died. Lombard, Lom, the chief engineer, the man who could listen to a misbehaving engine and tell you what was wrong with it. He was, by the testimony of those who worked with him, one of the finest troubleshooting engineers in the entire industry, the man you sent for when a problem had defeated everyone else. He died suddenly, at the very moment the company was embarking on the most difficult engineering program in its history. Stanley Hooker, brought back into all this later, wrote that Lombard's death left a vacuum that nobody could fill. Think about what that meant. The RB211 was a labyrinth of new problems, each one needing the kind of intuitive engineering judgment that takes a lifetime to build. And the one man whose judgment might have steered it through was gone, just as the labyrinth was being entered. The company that had always solved every problem had lost the man who solved the hardest ones, precisely when it needed him most. So the crisis was never really about a chicken and a carbon fibre blade. It was systemic. The three-shaft design was harder than anyone had reckoned. The engine was overweight and underpowered. The Hyfil gamble had failed and the recovery had cost dearly. The greatest troubleshooter was dead. And over all of it hung the fixed-price contract, ticking with its penalty clauses, demanding an engine that could be built for $840,000, when the true cost of building each one was climbing past $1 million. The numbers tell the story with terrible clarity. The launching aid the government had agreed in 1968 was meant to cover most of the cost of bringing the engine to market, a cost then put at £65 million. By November 1970, the figure had reached £135 million, and the company's own accounting put the development cost, by the autumn of 1970, at £170 million. The cost had not crept upward. It had more than doubled and then doubled again. Every engine Rolls-Royce built, it built at a loss. The harder the company worked, the more engines it delivered, the deeper into the ground it dug itself. Effort itself had become the enemy. This was the trap closing. Not a single mistake, but a structure, a contract that could not be escaped, wrapped around an engine that could not be built for the price, designed by a company that had lost the one man who might have saved it, and could not yet bring itself to believe that for the first time in its history, it might fail. Chapter 12. The Men Who Carried It. It is too easy, from this distance, to speak of the company deciding, the board agreeing, as though no human hands were on any of it. There were hands on all of it, and the fairest thing this story can do is name them, and refuse to make villains of men who were, in the end, undone by their own finest qualities. Sir Denning Pearson was the chief executive who set the course for America. He believed, with reason, that the company's future lay in the great American civil engines, and that to stand still was to die. He was not wrong about the prize. He was wrong about the price. Sir David Huddy was the man who won the Lockheed contract, who went to America, fought for it, and brought it home. He has been blamed for the fixed price terms more than any other man. But Huddy's instinct, that Rolls-Royce had to push to a new level of performance or be left behind, would in time be proved completely right. He simply could not have known what it would cost to get there. In July 1970, in the middle of the crisis, Huddy collapsed from sheer exhaustion. He left the company later that year. He never sought to justify himself in public, even when the engine he had fought for went on to triumph. There is a quiet dignity in that which the prosecutors of this story tend to overlook. Above and around them moved the government, because a company this large could not fall without the state being drawn in. The Labour government of Harold Wilson, through Tony Benn, had agreed launching aid of up to £47 million. When the costs began to spiral, the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation examined the company in 1969, found what it called manifest financial weakness, provided a loan, and put two men, Lord Beeching and Ian Morrow, onto the board to try to bring order. By November 1970, a new Conservative government under Edward Heath, with John Davies at the Department of Trade and Industry, agreed a further rescue, £42 million more in launching aid, with the banks to add £18 million, but only on one condition. An independent firm of accountants, Cooper Brothers, would go into Rolls-Royce and establish, once and for all, the true state of its finances. The audit was the moment the company could no longer hide from itself. Because when Cooper Brothers looked at the real numbers, the genuine cost of building each engine against the fixed price it could be sold for, the penalty clauses for late delivery, the development costs still climbing, the picture was not of a company in difficulty. It was of a company already destroyed and not yet fallen. Lockheed had contracted to pay $840,000 per engine. The bare cost of building one, without a penny of profit, had risen to $1,100,000. On top of that loomed something like $120 million in penalties for late delivery. There was no version of finishing the engine on these terms that did not bankrupt the company. The more it succeeded, the faster it would fail. When the audit revealed that, the rescue collapsed. You cannot pour money into a vessel with no bottom. And so the men who had inherited the most respected engineering name in the world were brought at last to the question no one at Rolls-Royce had ever seriously had to ask. Not how do we solve this, but can this be solved at all? In the early weeks of 1971, they arrived at their answer. Chapter 13. The day the name fell, on the 22nd of January 1971, the board concluded that the commitment to develop the RB211 could not be met. On the 26th of January, it decided the project should be brought to an end. On the 4th of February 1971, Rolls-Royce called in the receiver. His name was Rupert Nicholson, of the accountants Pete, Marwick, Mitchell. A receiver is the man who arrives when a company can no longer pay its debts, the man whose job is to take what is left and divide it among those who are owed. For 65 years, since the day Royce and Rolls put their names together, the company had stood for permanence, for reliability, for the thing that would never let you down. Now a man with a list of creditors was walking through the gates at Derby. The news broke over the country like something that could not be true. Rolls-Royce, the Merlin, the best car in the world, the name that meant perfection in every language. In receivership, trading in the shares was suspended. The stock market fell. In Parliament, John Davies rose to make what he called a grave statement, and Tony Benn, who had authorised that first late-night guarantee 3 years before, called the collapse a major national tragedy, a grave blow to confidence in the country. But it is the way the workers heard it that stays with you. They were told over the tannoy, the loudspeaker system that ran through the works, that called men to meetings and announced the shift changes. That was how the men of Derby learned that the company their fathers and grandfathers had built, the company they had given their working lives to, had collapsed. The voice came over the speakers and across the benches where they stood. Some of them were holding components in their hands when they heard, engines half built around them, the wall of sound from the test beds still rolling across the site, and a voice telling them it was over. There is a particular cruelty in that, not deliberate cruelty, just the blunt machinery of bad news in a vast organisation, that a man could be told the bottom had fallen out of his entire world by the same speaker that had called him to his tea break 1,000 times. What happened next is the part of the story that the simple headline gets most wrong, because the government of Edward Heath, a government that had come to power preaching that it would not prop up failing companies, that it would let the lame ducks of British industry sink or swim, moved within days to save what mattered. It did not save all of it. It could not, because the fixed-price Lockheed contract and its ruinous liabilities had to be left behind, cut away from the healthy parts of the business like dead tissue. So the government let the original Rolls-Royce Limited go into liquidation, carrying the contract and its debts down with it. But it bought the heart, the aero-engine business, the marine and industrial engines, the small engine work, into a brand new state-owned company, Rolls-Royce 1971 Limited. A bill to do it was through Parliament inside a week. Why save it, after all the talk of lame ducks? Because the engines were not just a business. They were the power behind Britain's frontline aircraft, behind Concorde, behind the new combat aircraft being built with European partners, behind the air forces of a dozen friendly nations. To let the aero-engine business of Rolls-Royce simply vanish was unthinkable for the defence of the country. Ideology met reality, and reality won within the week. And the cars? Here is the truth. The famous version of this story always gets backwards. The car division did not bring Rolls-Royce down, and Rolls-Royce did not drag the cars down with it. The cars were a separate enterprise, relatively healthy, and they were deliberately kept clear of the wreckage. In 1973, the car business was floated as a company in its own right, Rolls-Royce Motors, and went on building the Silver Shadow and the Phantom at Crewe, as though the catastrophe up in Derby had happened to someone else. Which, in a sense, it had. The empire that fell was the empire of engines. The cars, the public face, the spirit of ecstasy and the royal warrants, they sailed on, intact. The most luxurious name in motoring was never bankrupted by a jet engine. That is the legend. The reality is stranger and sadder. The crown jewel of British engineering, the Aero Engine Company, destroyed itself reaching for the future, and the cars simply walked away from the grave. Chapter 14. The Rescue. Across the Ocean. The fall of Rolls-Royce did not stay in Britain. It crossed the Atlantic because the company had pulled an American giant to the edge of the cliff with it. Lockheed had built the TriStar around the RB211. There was no other engine for it. The airframe and the engine had been designed for each other. When Rolls-Royce collapsed and the contract was repudiated, the TriStar had no power plant, and Lockheed, which had bet its own civil future on the aircraft, suddenly faced ruin of its own. The British failure threatened to take a major American manufacturer and tens of thousands of American jobs down with it. So, a deal had to be struck, and struck fast. In May 1971, the new state-owned Rolls-Royce signed a fresh contract with Lockheed. The crippling penalty clauses were cancelled. The price of each engine was raised by £110,000, closer, at last, to something the engine could actually be built for. But Lockheed was so close to the edge that even this was not enough on its own. The company needed its banks to keep lending, and the banks needed a guarantee. And so the matter went all the way to the Congress of the United States, where the government was asked to guarantee Lockheed's loans to keep the TriStar alive. It was bitterly fought. There were powerful voices against it, among them the governor of California, a man named Ronald Reagan, who objected to the government rescuing a private company. The vote in the Senate could hardly have been closer. The Emergency Loan Guarantee Act passed in August 1971 by a single vote, 49 to 48, one vote. That was the margin by which the TriStar survived, by which Lockheed survived, and by which something like 30,000 jobs at Rolls-Royce and its suppliers survived. A British company had reached so deep into the heart of American industry that the United States Senate had to be summoned to save it, and did so by the narrowest margin a vote can have. The engine that bankrupted Rolls-Royce had become, in its dying, a matter of state on 2 continents. Chapter 15. The Ones Who Paid. The receivership, in the cold accounting of it, was not the catastrophe it might have been. In the end, no employee lost his job through the receivership itself. The work went on, under the new state ownership. The receiver eventually realised something like £350 million, the equivalent of around 3 billion in today's money, and the shareholders, in time, received 64.5 pence for each share they had held. But behind the cold accounting were people who had given the company more than money, and who got back far less than they were owed. There were the shareholders who had bought into Rolls-Royce believing, as everyone believed, that it was the safest name in Britain, that you could no more lose your savings in Rolls-Royce than in the Bank of England. They watched their certainties turn to paper. And then there were the worker shareholders, and theirs is the bitterest part of the whole story. There were about 9,500 of them, ordinary employees who had been encouraged to buy shares in the company they worked for, to own a piece of it, to bind their futures to its success. Many of them were men near the end of their working lives who had put their savings and their hopes for retirement into the firm they had served for decades. Tony Benn laid it out in the House of Commons 2 years later, about 9,500 worker shareholders, the total value of their holdings under £2 million, an average holding of around £200, not the fortunes of speculators, but the careful savings of working men, and they were locked in. From November 1970, 3 months before the collapse, these worker shareholders were unable to sell, while the wider market could still trade. When the crash came, they could not get out. Some of them had put a life's prudence into those shares and watched it vanish and could do nothing but stand at their benches and listen to the tannoy. The government concluded that it could not single these people out for special compensation without being unfair to all the other shareholders and creditors. It was, perhaps, the correct decision in law. It did not feel like justice in Derby. The men who had built the engines, who had been urged to invest their faith and their savings in the name over the gate, were left with a fraction of what they had put in, while the world moved on to the next story. That is the human cost that no £3 billion realisation can balance, not the institution, the men, the ones who had been proudest to belong to it, and who paid the most to watch it fall. Chapter 16. The Engine That Came Good. And here the story turns, because this is not, in the end, a story of pure waste. It is something more complicated and more painful for being so. The nationalised company finished the engine. They brought Stanley Hooker out of retirement to do it. Hooker, the supercharger genius of the Merlin, now an old man, and he came back, and he brought old colleagues back with him, Cyril Lovesey and Arthur Rubbra, the veterans of the great piston engine days. These men who had helped win one war returned to fight one last battle for the company they loved, and they fixed the RB211. They turned the overweight, underpowered, ruinous engine into a reliable one. The TriStar received its certificate of airworthiness in the spring of 1972, around 9 months late, and the RB211 entered service that same year. And the three-shaft design, the very thing that had made the engine so hard to build, the architecture blamed for so much of the agony, turned out to be its enduring genius, because 3 shafts gave the engine room to grow. Over the years that followed, the RB211 was developed and stretched and improved. A version powered the Boeing 747. Another became the sole engine of the Boeing 757. The engine got better and better, and in 1989 it was given a new name, drawn, as the company's engines always were, from a river. They called it the Trent. The Trent family made Rolls-Royce one of the leading civil aero engine makers in the world, winning something like a third of all civil engine sales by the late 1990s. Sir David Huddy's instinct that the company had to push to a new level of performance or be left behind was, over a longer horizon than any receiver could see, completely vindicated. The engine that bankrupted Rolls-Royce became the foundation of its modern fortune, and the company itself came back. The state-owned Rolls-Royce was returned to private hands in 1987 under Margaret Thatcher as Rolls-Royce plc. Proud, profitable, and once again standing level with the Americans in the most demanding technology on Earth. The cars, meanwhile, lived their own separate life to its own strange end. Rolls-Royce Motors was bought by Vickers, and then, in 1998, sold in one of the most tangled deals in motoring history. Volkswagen bought the Crewe factory, the designs and the rights to the Spirit of Ecstasy and the grille for £430 million. But the right to the actual name Rolls-Royce was held by the Aero Engine Company, and that company licensed it not to Volkswagen, but to BMW for £40 million. So, from the 1st of January 2003, BMW built Rolls-Royce cars at a brand new factory at Goodwood, while Crewe, the old home, became the home of Bentley. The two great names that had shared a showroom for decades went their separate ways at last. Everything, in the end, survived. The engines, the company, the cars. The name that meant perfection still means it. Everything survived, except the thing that was actually lost. Chapter 17. What the silence remembers. What was lost was a certainty. For 65 years, Rolls-Royce had been the proof of something Britain badly wanted to believe about itself, that this country could still make the best in the world, that craft and confidence and the refusal to accept second best could carry a British company to the very top of the hardest technology there was, and keep it there. The men of Derby had lived inside that certainty. It was the bedrock under the terraced streets, the thing that made the future feel settled, the reason a boy could follow his father and his grandfather through the gates and never wonder whether the work would still be there. On the 4th of February, 1971, that certainty cracked. The company recovered. The certainty never entirely did. After Rolls-Royce could fall, anything could fall, and the long decline of British industry that filled the decades that followed had, in a sense, found its warning here, in the one place everyone had thought was unbreakable. The works on Nightingale Road still stand, and Rolls-Royce still builds engines in Derby to this day, which makes this a rarer thing than most of the stories of British industrial loss. There is no weed-strewn ruin here, no silent shell. The company lived, but walk the city and talk to the old men, and you will find the other ruin, the one that does not show, the memory of the tannoy, the day the bottom fell out of the safest name in Britain, the 9,500 who watched their savings vanish at their benches and were told that fairness made it impossible to give them back. The tragedy of Rolls-Royce, in the end, can be put in a single sentence. The company whose name meant perfection was very nearly destroyed by trying to build the most perfect engine in the world on terms that left no room at all for the imperfection of invention. They reached for the future. They very nearly didn't come back. And the future they reached for arrived, exactly as they had promised it would. The great three-shaft engine, the Trent, the thing that powers airliners across the world to this day. But it arrived too late for the men who paid for it, the proud workers of Derby who had given their savings and their faith to the name over the gate, and who never shared in the triumph their own ruin had made possible. That is the cost the ledgers never show. Not the engines, which came good, not the company, which survived, not even the money, most of which was, in the end, recovered. What was lost was the belief that some things could not fall, and once that is gone, it does not come back over the tannoy.